Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday and share it as the Mad podcast on your favorite platform. This week's parsha is Matot Maseh, and it talks about the power of our words. So in all honesty, I really can't promise that we'll light a spark or shed some light on this week's parsha, but we will, bli neder, review the laws of making and annulling vows, and in so doing, explore the ambiguous relationship that Judaism has with keeping one's word. So join us for No Promises. Well, here we are, Rabbi. We don't make any promises, but we're back for another week of Madlik Disruptive Torah.
Fantastic. Okay, really, really fantastic. Welcome back to the States. I'm happy you had a great trip, and we're excited to return to our regular scheduled time on Thursday evenings.
Absolutely. So I'm going to start with a joke. It's told that somebody in New York City is rushing to get to his appointment. He drove in from the suburbs, and he's looking for a parking spot. And as is typical, he can't find the parking spot. So finally, he throws up his arms, and he says, God, Hashem, if you give me a parking spot, I am going to start going to shul every Shabbat. He waits for a minute and a half. Miraculously, the car in front of him pulls out. He gets the parking spot. And as he does, he turns up to God and he goes, never mind. I got it myself. So obviously the joke plays with this concept of, number one, making a vow, a pledge, and I would say our human, very human ability to forget those vows and pledges and to, at least in our own mind, annul it. So the topic of tonight is what the parsha talks about in terms of making these kinds of vows, but it's equally about annulling those vows. And at the end of the day, it's about how seriously do we take what we say. So we're in Numbers 30, and it says, if a person makes a vow to God or takes an oath imposing an obligation on himself, he shall not break his pledge. He must carry out all that has crossed his lips. Kechol hayotze mipiv ya'aseh. I mean, right there, that's a beautiful bumper sticker. You know, what you say is what you should do. And at a certain level, that's the bottom of what a neder is it not?
It sure is. That's correct. You have to fulfill what you promise, what you say.
So unbelievably, it goes on for the next 16, 17 odd psukim, and it focuses on one situation, which if we were focusing on the portrayal of women or women's rights or status in the Bible, we could just focus on that all night. But what it talks about is under what conditions is a vow made by a woman able to be annulled by her father, her husband. But this year, we're not going to be focusing on the feminist angle here. But what we are going to focus on, as I made clear in a few seconds ago, is that it, in a sense, goes from making the vow to focusing on annulling the vow. Because if you take away the sense of it's about women, it's really about situations, conditions that can create a situation where you can hafar, you can annul her vows. So in Numbers 39, it says, but if a husband restrains her on the day and he learns of it and thereby annuls her vow which was in force, are the commitment which was bound by, and Hashem will forgive her. So someone in charge of her, let's put it that way, somebody of higher power can annul her vow. And of course, from here the rabbis learn that anybody's vow can be annulled. You just have to go to a higher authority, whether it be to your husband, your father, or a court. And then it talks about a situation where he doesn't annul it in time, for instance, but if he annuls them after the day he finds out, he shall bear her guilt. So it really is creating a sort of ecosystem where vows are made, vows can be nullified, and if they can't be nullified and they are not fulfilled, the blame can be had on the person who makes the vow or those who are in charge who should have gotten rid of the vow. But it's a kind of interesting ecosystem, and it's an interesting way to introduce this concept of vows where the focus is much more on, I wouldn't say the exception than the rule, but on the annulment rather than making the vow. Do you find that of interest as well?
I think that is interesting, especially because they don't seem to want you to annul the vow. They'd much rather that you either didn't take a vow, and if you took a vow, that you fulfilled a vow. Annulment seems to be only necessary if you don't do what's preferable. Right? That's interesting, isn't it?
I mean, it kind of begs the question, and this is something that maybe we'll get into, is why the woman is a good case for someone making a vow. And if, in fact, the key here is you could make a hierarchy. You said it's better to keep the vow than to annul it, and I will add one more strati to that, which is it's better yet never to make the vow. So you have don't make the vow, and we'll get into some verses along those lines in a second. If you make the vow, keep it, and then if you make a vow, annul it. That could be, we're talking about the different players here or the different scenarios. It's fascinating, and one of my favorite sources, as you know, is thetorah.com. They talk that these verses are actually in counter-distinction to Numbers 6:2, which says, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, if any men or women explicitly utter a Nazarite's vow to set themselves apart from God." It says, Ish o Isha. So it is kind of interesting that the first time we came across rules and regulations to do with the vows, men and women were treated equally. Here we're talking about a situation where the power, the efficacy of the woman is certainly put into check. My sense is, and this is where I'm going to make my mark, is that really the woman represents something. She represents the person, the individual who is lacking power, you don't make a vow unless you need that parking spot. If everything is going well, you don't have to make this kind of oath. So to give you some examples of vows, and let's get into the meat of it, what is a vow? In Genesis 28:20, Jacob has gone up, seen the angels going up and down the ladder. He's about to depart on his Odysseus's voyage, and he says he makes a vow. He says, "V'yidor Yaakov neder lemor." If, and all vows of this type begin with an if, and then there's a then. If God remains with me, protecting me on this journey that I am making, and giving me bread to eat and clothing to wear, and I return safe to my father's house, God shall be my God. And this stone which I have set up as a pillar shall be God's abode, so forth and so on. And the next thing you have is the Temple Mount. But the point is that it's an if then. He is in a very sticky situation. He's in a very vulnerable situation. And he says, if you get me out of this situation, if you stay with me, you'll be my God. I'll build you a house. I think that's kind of key to a sense of where vows come into play. What is your take on that?
No, I think that, I think that's right. And I think it goes back to how we started. And that is, there are three options. One option is not to take a vow at all. One option is to take the vow and to keep the vow. And the third option is to cancel the vow, to annul the vow. right? Those are three different options. And the question really is here, which is preferable? Now, of course, there's a fourth option, which is to break your vow, right? I take a vow not to eat ice cream. And all of a sudden, there's an amazing ice cream sundae in front of me, and I break the vow. But that's explicit that that's a violation. That's a sin, right? That's one of the 613 laws, is that you're not allowed to break your vow. So there actually are four options on how you deal with a vow. And the question, you're bringing up the right point, which is, what does the Torah really want us to do? Does the Torah not want us to take a vow? Does the Torah want us to take a vow? Does the Torah want us to take a vow, but understand that it's really a kind of a hierarchy, a hierarchy of who controls? That's a really good issue.
So I love the fact that you bring up this fourth type of vow, which is kind of before I started my research this week, which was the typical vow that I think of. We all think of Samson, someone who vows not to drink wine, a Nazarite. And I think that's my answer to the question of what happened in the earlier verse where it says men and women. There it was talking about simply bringing a sacrifice within your means to God. It was similar to taking a vow of chastity, a vow of trying to get to a higher spiritual level. Clearly, the vows we're talking about here come, I believe, from being marginalized and weak. We see that in Jacob. Let's talk about the most famous one, which is 1 Samuel, and it's Hannah. Hannah made the vow, O Lord of hosts, if, here we have the if again, you will look upon the suffering of your maidservant and will remember me and not forget your maidservant. And if you will grant your maidservant a male child, then I will dedicate him to the Lord for all the days of his life. I think this really hits the hammer on the head. I was saying to myself, scratching my head, are women so likely to be making vows all the time? And then if you think of it, because women control so little of their life in the ancient Near East, it is likely that a woman would make a vow, if you grant me a husband, if you grant me a child. And you could see how that would impact upon those in charge of her, the father, the husband, so to speak. But again, it comes out of this sense of you make the kind of contingent vow that we're talking about if you're subservient, if you're marginalized. I mean, in the last one comes in Proverbs where he talks about a harlot, a prostitute who is inviting a man to be with her, and it ends by saying, and we together can fulfill my vows. Hayom shilamti nidorai. The idea to me is that vows of this type are made under extenuating circumstances. And in a sense, and this is something that the great modern biblical commentary, Milgram, talks about, is vows are promissory by definition, but they differ from promissory oaths in that they are conditional. And he goes on to quote another scholar, a woman who takes the initiative to make a vow or to abstain from somebody thereby puts herself outside the patriarchal control. So we're seeing people who take these vows as trying to control their lives because maybe they don't have all of the levers and tools necessary.
Good. I think that's good. Now, let's just go back for a minute to Hannah. She takes a vow, but it's not about herself. It's about her son. Taking a vow for other people is especially complicated, right? It's one thing if I say I won't eat chocolate, but it's a chutzpah for me to say that I take a vow that you won't eat chocolate.
That's true. That's true. And that kind of talks a little bit about the issue of vows and relationships. And maybe that's an explanation of bringing in the father and the husband. Because of the familial relationship, they're impacted by this woman's vow. Now, of course, you could make an argument that then she should have a say over their vows, but that would be pushing it a little far for the ancient Near East. But I get you exactly. She makes a vow, and the husband might be impacted by it. The father might be impacted by it.
I mean, I think that's the point of the Chumash. The Chumash's point is that everything that affects the wife affects the husband, because in those days, the wife was totally subservient to the husband. So therefore, her job was to take care of the husband. So if she's limited in some way, it means that he's going to be limited in some way. That's kind of taken for granted almost, isn't it?
Yeah. No, absolutely. It's this connectivity. So I said we were going to talk as much about annulment as we were going to talk about the vows. I think we've gotten to the point already where we all can agree that it's better not to be in a situation where you need a vow. And it's almost for people that need that parking spot, if you will. But in terms of the annulment, the Mishnah in the Nedarim says as follows. It's 23a. It says, everyone, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, everyone who wants to take a vow prohibiting another from benefiting from him, but only in order that they should eat with him, not intending to take an actual vow, should say to him at the outset, any vow that I take in the future is void. And this statement is effective provided that he remembers at the time of the vow. So now, I Googled the old thing of crossing your fingers when you say something so it's not true anymore.
That's Christian. It's not. That's like knock on wood.
That's Christian. But the idea here is, and obviously you're all thinking about kol nidre already, and we'll get to that in a second. How can you make that vow of getting that parking spot, and then when you get the parking spot, saying, never mind. So, I think I was trying to figure out the real explanation of the Mishnah, and the only way I could, I'm curious to know whether you agree with me. It's kind of like I say to you, Adam, if you don't come over for dinner, I will never play golf with you. I'm not going to do the Modlik podcast with you anymore. So the guy really just wants his friend to come over from dinner, but he says something that will use the vow to leverage his situation.
Good. The vow is power.
The vow is power for the powerless.
Right.
He can't control his buddy, but nonetheless, so it even adds, now already we're starting to really think of this whole vowing as something that is a little bit shady, a little bit, it's uncomfortable, because now you're making a vow with your hand behind your back and you're saying, I really don't mean it. And true to form, the Gemara goes on and says, and in addition, one who desires that his vows not be upheld for the entire year should stand up on Rosh Hashanah and say, any vow that I take in the future should be void, and this statement is affected provided that he remembers at the time of the vow. This is the source for the most famous prayer we call the night of Yom Kippur, Kol Nidre. We call the whole service based on this vow, which I think has flabbergasted, and we'll see some of the responses, everybody, because it's this very legalistic formula for nullifying one's vows.
Yeah, well, Kol Nidre is its own story. Because what exactly is Kol Nidre? In the middle of Kol Nidre, there are two different versions. One is Miyom Kippurim She'avar ad Yom Kippurim Zeh, and the other is Miyom Kippurim Zeh ad Yom Kippurim Haba Aleinu L'Tova. One says from last Yom Kippur to this Yom Kippur, and the other is from this Yom Kippur to next Yom Kippur. Is Kol Nidre an annulment of previous vows or annulment of vows to come? That's a whole different psychology. It's one thing to annul vows of what we said in the past. You should know that the Christians made fun of Kol Nidre because the Christians said that the Jews used to promise the Christians money, and then they used to recite Kol Nidre, and therefore they were, they were no longer bound to pay the Christians. That actually led the Reform movement in the 1800s to eliminate Kol Nidre. I'll just tell you something funny about Kol Nidre. The Reform movement eliminated Kol Nidre, but they loved the tune. So they used to play the tune on the organ, but not use the words, which is amazing. So it's just interesting the way Kol Nidre plays. It might be an annulment of vows that are going to be taken in the coming year, which is a whole different phenomenon.
So, the history of Kol Nidre is worth a podcast just by itself. I totally agree. I want to get to it, but before I leave Nidarim, I want to talk about something that was written almost as a footnote in the Talmud, and it says that Rav Huna Bar Hanina intended to teach this topic at the holiday lecture. I guess he was going to give it at the Shabbos Tshuva Drasha, so that everybody should learn the manner of rendering vows on Rosh Hashanah. And Rava said to him, how can you teach this in public? This whole sense that you can annul these vows is really something that we kind of keep kind of private amongst us rabbis, because we don't want the public to treat vows lightly. We don't want them to be mezalzel. So all of a sudden, you also again, and it gets back to this sense of hierarchy, there's those who control when something is annulled and when it's not. And as you say, there are many people who feel, great scholars, who said that Kol Nidre should never been there. One of the scholars called it a minhag shtut, something that shouldn't have been done. The conservative Machzor actually follows a number of commentaries that, because of the kind of criticism that you bring up from the Christians, which wasn't really a joke. I mean, this was a very big source of anti-Semitism, that you can't trust what a Jew says. And one of the answers was that Kol Nidre does not affect relationships between me and you. So if I owe you $50, or if I've promised to make the Madlik podcast with you every week, it doesn't affect that. It has to do with promises that I've made to myself. I want to go onto a diet this year. I want to go to shul every Shabbat, and promises that I make to God. So in the translation of the Rabbinical Assembly, the conservative movement, it adds in the English translation promises that we vow, or promises to ourselves and to God, which is a neat way of getting around this problem. But I think, and you say that the Reform actually took out Kol Nidre. One of my sources came up with something fascinating, and that is they changed the word neder to sin. Instead of it saying that all my vows from the past year, they turned it to all my transgressions, and the transgressions of this congregation from the last year and from the year ahead. And I think we're starting to see the flavor of the rabbis and tradition looking at vows, that there is an aspect of them that kind of smacks of sin, or at least of weakness, or at least of being compromised, that you hope in the past year and you hope in the year ahead you won't be put into a situation where you have to succumb to the need to make this vow. I think there's a certain level of brilliance in at least Geiger, who was the Reform rabbi who made this change. It certainly makes a lot more sense.
That's great. I didn't know that, but that makes a lot of sense. I mean, that's a way of solving the problem of keeping Kol Nidre, but avoiding the issue of vows.
So, I mean, ultimately, you don't want to be put into this situation, I think, and I think that's what kind of unites what we've discussed in terms of why women were singled out as kind of secondary citizens, or at least citizens or members of the Bible who are constantly faced with barrenness, as Hannah was, who are forced into this situation where they need this type of tool to get them out of it. I'm reminded of a beautiful. I think we did a podcast about a wonderful book by Agnon called "Making the Crooked Straight." And he quotes a verse of Isaiah, "Let the crooked be made straight." And I found an amazing Kli Yakar based on the Midrashim, who said, when the Jews left Egypt, they had to fib at the suggestion of God to Pharaoh. They said, "We just want to go worship God, and then we'll be coming back." And you really can make a case of all the fibs that the Jewish people as a minority, as a disenfranchised people have had to make, and breaking those fibs or having them annulled. And what the Kli Yakar says is, we'll know we've been redeemed when we can tell the truth. When my explanation is, when we requested the state of Israel in the Balfour Declaration or from the government of England, and we didn't tell a fib. We didn't say we just want to go there to be tourists. We literally told the truth. It's kind of fascinating that this whole sense of needing to be crooked, needing to make the oath and then maybe not live by it, is part of the diaspora or the ghetto mentality, and that we look forward. The optimal is not to make the oath at all, not to have to make this deal. We're luckily not talking about a deal with the devil. We're talking about a deal with God. But as it says in Ecclesiastes 5:4, it is better not to vow at all than to vow and not fulfilled. It's this whole sense. And I, because we've talked about kol nidre, I want to talk about another part of our combined Jewish culture. I think if you ask what expression by Jews is, what the most traditional expression of Jews is, you would say Baruch Hashem, thank God. But the second might be Bli neder. Bli neder is what you say when next week we're going to do Madlik again, Rabbi. Bli neder. I'm
right.
not making an oath. It's really like no promises. I'm not making any type of commitment. And it's so these few verses in the Bible that talk about making these vows are kind of so baked into a Jewish culture that it really is a fascinating topic to discuss of how we use our words. In the source sheet that's connected to the podcast, you can see situations where rabbis discuss what is telling the truth and what is not. Can you lie to make somebody do a mitzvah? Can you lie in order for a higher good? And, we live in a day where part of the judicial reform is leaders telling the people, don't worry about it. We're going to take care of you. We're going to do this, and we're not going to override your rights. And those against it saying, we don't need to trust you, or we can't trust you. So in a sense, it's a very timely discussion about where Judaism stands in terms of what you say is what you mean, or are there other ulterior motives, objectives that you want to achieve? And I think this whole concept of neder comes definitely from people who have been marginalized, and we have to worry about it now that we have our own state and we are the balabayit, we have to really kind of do a reboot and make sure that what we say actually is what we mean. That's my take coming fresh from Israel on neder, Rabbi.
Thank you very, very much. It's a great topic. Welcome back, and I look forward to continuing next week. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom, bli neder. I will see you all next week, and let's make sure that what we say is what we mean.
Amen.
Amen. Have a great week. And if there's anyone who has a comment or a suggestion, please feel free to raise your hand, and I'm happy to invite you onto the Bima. Lauren, how are you this week?
I have a question. I'm not sure we may be skipping a step here, and I wanted to get your feeling about this. Throughout Genesis, God makes a lot of vows, a lot of promises, a lot of if-thens to the Jewish people, and sets the stage for this whole concept of if you do the right thing, then you will be rewarded, and if you don't, you won't be. Doesn't our liturgy set the example for our religion of the issue of vows by the initial proclamations that are written in our literature? And I guess the end of my question is does God need a parking spot also? And if he does, or if God does, how do we deal with that? Because we're not really addressing the example that was set.
As usual, I absolutely love your question. The name, the word used for the vow the contingent vow that we make with God is called covenant. It's called Brit. And literally it is based, according to modern research by academics, on vassal treaties of, again, a vassal talking to the ruler and saying, if you protect me, I will be loyal to you. So you are absolutely on the money, because there are many people, if you asked what the essence of Judaism is, they would say it's the covenant. It's the covenant that the Jewish people have made with God, or to be a little broader, it's a covenant that mankind, because Noah made a covenant too, makes with God, that God is involved in our lives. But you're absolutely correct. He's involved in a tit-for-tat type of relationship. And you do wonder why God needs, the unanswered question is, why does God need to make a covenant with us? We all know why we need to make a covenant with God, but why does he need us? There is this inescapable need on both parts. It's a codependency. It's a codependent relationship. And I think, there are so many times in the Bible that the relationship of God to the Jewish people is seen as a relationship between a husband and a wife. What you said even rings true for the verses that we're speaking about. I'd love to look at Philo, who always interprets the Bible allegorically, whether he sees it that way. But I think you're hitting the nail on the head. And I think, as much as I would love to have a world where we don't need parking spots, where we don't need to make these quid pro quo contingencies, I think maybe what we're both saying is that God did create a world where we have these codependencies and we do need each other. And so as much as it says it's better not to make a vow, but if you make a vow, keep it. I think that makes the discussion of the vow, the neder, that much more important, because it's really almost talking about the structure, the essence, the core of Judaism, of the Hebrew Bible, and who knows where the discussion could go as to how we need each other, and when the husband, the Baal, can annul it, and when he can't. I think, to take your point about God needing the parking spot as well, we certainly, I think, the core of Judaism, and this I think comes through on a week in, week out basis when we study the Torah, is that yes, God created this world where he created a dependency on his behalf. And that's if I was a Christian, I would call that a mystery. but the truth is that is what the unanswered question, but also the beauty which creates all of the lyricism of the Bible, of God talking to us as children, that he loves desperately and needs desperately and wants desperately to listen to him, and maybe sometimes smiles when we don't listen to him, just as we smile when our children maybe don't listen to us all the time and go in a different direction. I love the question, and I love how it broadens it into a much more core discussion about the world, the universe of the Hebrew Bible, of Judaism, and of the Torah.
Okay, well, there's much more to talk about on this, but I want to welcome you back, and I really would like to hear how the captain did.
Well, I'm going to have to give you a call and tell you about my trip following the path of Odysseus, because I did see Ithaca, and I landed there too. So who knows?
Oh, great.
Anyway,
well, Shabbat Shalom.
It's great to hear your voice. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.
See you all next week. Bye-bye.